Millionaire pretends to be blind to test homeless woman's honesty, but when he drops his wallet near her, he's shocked by what she does next. Night was falling over Fairview, enveloping the city in shadows and flickering lights. Richard Meyer walked slowly through the silent streets, feeling the weight of his own existence with each step. His life of luxury and business success no longer filled the emptiness growing inside him. He felt distant from himself, as if at some point he had lost connection with who he really was. Upon spotting an elderly woman sitting at the entrance of an alley, Richard felt a strange impulse. Dressed in worn clothes, her face marked by time and suffering, she observed the movement on the street with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present. He took his wallet from his pocket and deliberately dropped it, then walked a few steps and stopped, pretending to be disoriented. "Sir!" her voice called out to him, hoarse but firm. When he turned around, he saw her holding his wallet, with trembling fingers. Richard hesitated, then began his charade. I can't see," he said, his voice laden with vulnerability. "I'm blind." The elderly woman stared at him for a moment and, instead of showing pity or doubt, smiled gently. "A man who has already lost everything cannot lose his wallet too." The phrase hit Richard in an unexpected way. He took the object from her hands and for a moment forgot he was pretending. "What do you mean?" he asked, genuinely curious. The lady shrugged, her eyes carrying a silent wisdom. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," she replied simply. "What's your name?" asked Richard, abandoning the charade, a sudden sincerity emerging in his voice. "Martha," she answered, showing no surprise at the change in his behavior. "And you? Who are you behind that mask you wear?" Her words hit him like a direct blow. He had never been questioned that way, so direct and penetrating. "Richard Meyer," he answered, extending his hand to help her up. "And I'd like to invite you to dinner, Miss Martha." The elderly woman hesitated, analyzing him with perceptive eyes that seemed to see through every layer of pretense he had built over the years. "Why?" she asked simply. "If this story interested you, watch until the end and subscribe to our channel to receive all our exciting stories." Continuing. Richard didn't have a ready answer. For the first time in years, he was acting on impulse, moved by something he couldn't name. "Maybe because I need someone who sees me as I really am," he said, surprising himself with the honesty of that confession. Martha smiled and accepted his hand. "Then let's have dinner, Richard Meyer, but don't take me to those fancy places where they serve small portions on big plates. I want real food." Richard laughed, a genuine sound he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. "I know the perfect place," he replied, offering his arm as support. Neither of them could imagine how that casual encounter would change their lives forever. In the simple restaurant in the old neighborhood, Richard watched Martha as she savored each forkful of the beef stew. There was something hypnotic about the way she appreciated each moment, each flavor, as if that meal were a precious treasure. "How long have you been living on the streets?" he asked, trying to understand the story of this enigmatic woman. Martha took a sip of water before answering. "Who said I live on the streets? I just assumed from the way I found you. Appearances can be deceiving, can't they? Just like a rich man pretending to be blind to test a stranger." She looked at him, but there was no accusation in her gaze, just a calm observation. Richard felt his face flush. "You knew?" "From the first moment," Martha smiled. "I'm 75 years old, my boy. I've seen a lot in this life. People who can see pretending to be blind. Blind people pretending they can see. The world is full of masks." He nodded, genuinely embarrassed. "I'm sorry for the ridiculous test. I don't know what came over me." "I know what came over you," she replied, wiping her mouth with the napkin. "Loneliness. The kind that persists even when surrounded by people. I know that feeling well." Richard felt a lump in his throat. How could a stranger read him so easily when even his closest lovers had never managed to? "So, tell me," he changed. The subject, "Where do you live?" "I have a small room at the back of a boarding house on Maple Street. Nothing luxurious, but it's my corner." She paused. "And you? You must live in one of those mansions on Highland Hill, am I right?" "Yes," he answered, A house too big for just one person. Houses aren't too big, philosophized Martha. It's hearts that become too small when one is alone. Again, Richard felt as if this woman could see directly into his soul. He paid the bill, and upon leaving realized he didn't want to say goodbye. "May I walk you to your boarding house?" "Of course," she accepted with a smile. "But be careful, Richard Meyer. People like me are dangerous." "Dangerous?" he questioned, intrigued. "Yes, because we make others face truths they would prefer to ignore." During the walk to the boarding house, Richard knew he was facing a decision that would change his life. An idea formed in his mind, as sudden as it was intense. "Miss Martha," he began hesitantly, "I know we've only known each other for a few hours, but I'd like to make you a proposal." She looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "What kind of proposal would a man like you make to an old woman like me?" "Come live in my house," the words came out before he could contain them. "I have empty rooms, plenty of space. You would have comfort, privacy." Martha stopped walking and looked at him seriously. "Why?" "Because—" He searched for the right words. "Because I think we need each other. You need a better place to live out your golden years, and I need someone who can teach me to see again." The elderly woman studied him for long seconds before responding. "Are you sure you want a stranger in your home?" "I have the impression that I've known you for much longer than a few hours," confessed Richard. "And besides, it would be temporary, until you find a better place, no commitments." Martha smiled, an enigmatic gleam in her eye. "All right, Richard Meyer, I accept your proposal, but with one condition." "Which is?" "That you understand I'm not a charity. I am a person, and people are not projects that you take on when you're bored with your own existence." The harsh sincerity of her words surprised him, but also made him respect her even more. "Deal," he replied, extending his hand to seal the agreement. As they went to retrieve her belongings from the boarding house, Richard had no idea how deeply that impulsive decision would alter the course of his life and reveal secrets long buried in his past. The Meyer mansion, imposing in its classics architecture, seemed to observe Martha's arrival with suspicion. The elderly woman contemplated the construction for a few moments before climbing the steps to the entrance. "Nice place," she commented, as Richard opened the heavy carved wooden door. "But it lacks life here." He nodded, feeling the weight of those words. The mansion, with its expensive furniture and valuable artwork, was more a showcase of wealth than a home. "Sebastian!" called Richard, and a middle-aged butler appeared in the entrance hall. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Martha beside his employer. "Yes, Mr. Meyer. This is Ms. Martha. She will be our guest for an indefinite period. Please prepare the guest room in the east wing." Sebastian hesitated for a second, but soon nodded. "Immediately, sir. Would you like something to drink while I prepare the room?" "I would accept a chamomile tea," Martha replied with a gentle smile. "If it's not too much trouble." "Not at all, ma'am. I'll be back in a moment." As the butler walked away, Richard led Martha to the living room. She observed every detail with a curiosity that seemed to go beyond simple interest. "What do you do for a living, Richard?" she asked, settling into a velvet armchair. "I'm a businessman. I inherited Meyer Developments from my father and expanded it over the last 15 years. He poured himself a whiskey. "We've built some of the most important buildings in the city. And does that make you happy?" The direct question caught him off guard. Richard swirled the amber liquid in the glass, reflecting. "It did, for a time. Today I'm not so sure anymore. Is that why you test people on the streets, to feel something?" Richard sighed. "Maybe. I'd never done that before, to be honest. It was an impulse." Martha nodded as if she understood perfectly. "When we lose our way, we do strange things trying to find ourselves." "And you? What did you do before—" "Well, before I got old and poor," she completed with an ironic smile. "I was many things, Richard. I was a mother, a wife, a worker. I was a housekeeper in family homes, mainly." The conversation was interrupted by Sebastian's arrival with the tea and some fine cookies. "The room will be ready in 20 minutes, sir," the butler informed. "Does the lady have any luggage?" "Just this bag," replied Martha, indicating the worn canvas sack she carried. "I travel lightly through life." After Sebastian withdrew, Richard noticed something curious. Martha seemed to know the place. Her eyes scanned the environments with a disconcerting familiarity. "Have you been in a house like this before?" he asked. Martha sipped her tea before answering. "Many times. As I said, I worked in family homes. Mansions like this hold more secrets than one might imagine." Something in the way she spoke made Richard feel a chill, as if those words carried a greater weight than they appeared to. "Come, I'll show you the rest of the house," he offered, trying to dispel the strange sensation that had invaded him. As they toured the rooms, Richard noticed how Martha avoided certain places. She passed straight by the library door, and when they came near the old children's room, now transformed into an office, she quickened her pace. "Don't you want to see this room?" he asked, intrigued. "It's not necessary," she replied, with an almost imperceptible tension in her voice. "I see that you've transformed the house a lot since you acquired it. Actually, it's been in the family for generations. I grew up here." Martha just nodded without commenting. But Richard noticed that her eyes had become slightly watery. That night, after dinner and settling Martha in her new room, Richard couldn't sleep. There was something about the presence of that lady that awakened dormant sensations and memories. He decided to go down to the library to get a book. That might help him relax. As he passed through the corridor, he saw a faint light coming from under Martha's door. He hesitated but decided to check if she needed anything. He knocked softly. "Come in." Her voice sounded calm from the other side. Richard opened the door and found Martha sitting in an armchair by the window, observing the moon. In her hands, she held a small, shiny object that he couldn't immediately identify. "Sorry to disturb you so late. I saw the light and thought you might need something." "I just can't sleep in new places on the first night," she smiled. "Old habits from a nomadic life." Richard nodded, understanding, and then noticed what she was holding. A small crystal horse, a delicate and visibly old piece. "Beautiful object," he commented. Martha held it up to the lamplight, a gift from a very special child many years ago. "He loved horses. And you've kept it all this time." "Some memories are too powerful to be left behind," she replied, with a distant look. "Even when we leave, we take with us what truly matters." Richard felt an inexplicable connection to those words and that object. "Good night, Miss Martha. Sleep well when sleep comes." "Good night, Richard, and—" She paused. "Thank you for bringing me here." He smiled and closed the door softly. In the corridor, he stopped to reflect on the strange feeling that invaded him. It was as if Martha wasn't a stranger he had just met, but someone who had been absent for a long time and had finally returned. The following days brought a subtle transformation to the Meyer mansion. Martha's presence, initially strange to the staff, soon became a balm for the previously cold and formal environment. Her simple and direct manner won over even the stern housekeeper Helen, who at first looked with suspicion at the master's special guest. Richard, in turn, began to arrive late to work, something unprecedented in his rigorous routine. He preferred to have breakfast with Martha, listening to her stories and observing how she could talk about the simplest things with a wisdom that fascinated him. On a particularly pleasant morning, as they were talking on the porch, Richard received a call that made him frown. "Good morning, Laura," he answered, his voice subtly changing to a more formal tone. "Yes, I know the meeting is scheduled for today. No, I haven't forgotten. I'll be there in an hour." Upon hanging up, he noticed Martha's curious gaze. "My assistant," he explained, "always concerned about my punctuality." "Laura," repeated Martha, as if savoring the name. "Beautiful name, and by your expression, an important young woman." Richard smiled, uncomfortable. "Laura Winters. She's worked with me for 5 years. Started as an intern, and today she's my right hand in the company. Extremely competent and extremely demanding." "And beautiful?" asked Martha, with a playful gleam in her eyes. "Very," admitted Richard, feeling strangely exposed. "But I've never mixed business with— well, you understand." "I understand," nodded Martha. "Sometimes the barriers we create to protect ourselves end up isolating us from the best possibilities. That phrase kept echoing in Richard's mind as he drove to the office. Laura, always impeccable in her elegant suits, was waiting for him, at the entrance of the Meyer Developments building. "Good morning, Richard," she greeted him, handing him a folder. "The financial reports you requested and the contract from Sunrise Construction for review. The meeting with investors is at 10:30. "Good morning, Laura," he replied, observing her as if seeing her for the first time. "You look different today." She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Different how?" "I can't explain it. Maybe I'm the one seeing things differently." Laura studied him with curiosity. "You've been acting strange lately. You cancelled 2 important meetings last week. You arrived late. Is everything okay?" "Actually, I'm better than I've been in a long time," confessed Richard. "I met someone who's changing my perspective on many things." Laura's face immediately closed. "I see. Well, I'm happy for you." Her professional voice disguised what her eyes couldn't hide: disappointment. "It's not what you're thinking," he hurried to explain. "It's an elderly lady I met by chance. She's staying at my house temporarily." Laura stared at him, incredulous. "You took a stranger to your home?" "Trust me, she's not an ordinary stranger." Before they could continue the conversation, they were interrupted by Anthony Meyer, Richard's uncle and minority partner in the company, a corpulent man of 60 with a perpetually discontented face. "Ah, the busy nephew finally graces us with his presence," he exclaimed with irony. "I hope this meeting with the Japanese isn't another of your megalomaniacal projects that end up bleeding the company's coffers." Richard took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "The Japanese, as you so delicately put it, Uncle, represent the largest real estate group in Asia. If we close this partnership, Meyer Developments will take a leap that not even my father dreamed possible." "Your father," Anthony spat the words, "knew how to recognize limits. You think you can reinvent the market?" "I'll take that as a compliment," replied Richard, heading toward the elevator with Laura. "By the way, I'd like to invite you to dinner at my house this weekend. I want to introduce you to someone." Anthony frowned, suspicious. "One of your sophisticated girlfriends wanting to impress the family?" "Something much better," smiled Richard, enigmatically. "See you later, Uncle." In the elevator, Laura couldn't contain her curiosity. "Why invite your uncle? You always say he's a bitter old man who only thinks about money." "Exactly for that reason," replied Richard. "I think he needs to meet Martha as much as I did." Laura observed him with an intrigued expression. "You really are different. This Martha must be someone very special." "She is," confirmed Richard. "And I'd like you to meet her too. Come to dinner on Saturday." The invitation caught Laura by surprise. In 5 years working together, it was the first time Richard had invited her to his home for a social occasion. "I'll have to check my schedule," she replied, trying to sound indifferent. Richard smiled, noticing her discomfort. "Come on, Laura. I know you don't have any commitments on Saturdays besides watching documentaries with a glass of wine." She blushed slightly. "How do you know that?" "You mentioned it once, about 3 years ago. I have a good memory." The elevator reached the top floor where Richard's office was located. Before the doors opened, Laura held him by the arm. "What's happening to you, Richard? Really?" He looked at her for a moment, surprised by the intensity of her gaze. "I'm beginning to see what's always been in front of me, but I never truly saw." The doors opened, ending the moment of intimacy, but something had changed between them. An invisible line had been crossed. Meanwhile, at the Meyer mansion, Martha was slowly exploring every corner of the property. Her steps led her to the basement, a place Richard hadn't shown during the tour. She descended the steps carefully, turning on the light. The space was full of boxes, old furniture covered by sheets, and various objects stored over decades. Martha walked among those, fragments of memory, occasionally touching an item here and there as if she could feel the history contained in them. It was then that she found a carved wooden box with the initials CM, Charles Meyer, Richard's father. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity was stronger. She opened the box and found various old photographs, yellowed documents, and small mementos. Carefully, she removed one particular photograph. It showed an elegant couple holding a baby, and beside them, a younger woman. Martha looked fixedly at the image, her eyes welling up. Helen, the housekeeper, appeared at the top of the stairs. "What are you doing here?" she asked, suspicious. Martha turned, not hiding the photograph. "Just exploring. Old houses hold so many stories." Helen descended a few steps, her gaze fixed on the photograph in Martha's hands. "That's the late Mr. Charles with his wife Elizabeth and little Richard." Her eyes narrowed. "And that woman beside them." "It's me," completed Martha, with a tranquility that contrasted with the tension in the air. "Almost 40 years ago." Helen took a step back, shocked. "Impossible. You never mentioned that you knew the family." "Neither did Richard recognize me," replied Martha, placing the photograph back in the box. "To him, I'm just an elderly woman he found on the street." "But that's a lie." "No, Helen. It's just part of a story that hasn't reached its end yet." The housekeeper seemed torn between alerting her employer and keeping the newly discovered secret. "Why didn't you tell him the truth?" Martha sighed, closing the box carefully. "Because some truths need to be discovered, not told. Richard needs to find me in his memories, not in my words." Helen shook her head, confused. "I don't understand." "What you intend?" "I'm not here to cause any harm," assured Martha. "I promise that Richard will know everything at the right time. Until then, I ask that you keep this secret." The housekeeper hesitated, but something in Martha's gaze, a mixture of determination and kindness, made her reluctantly nod. "I won't interfere. But if I perceive that this is hurting Mr. Richard, then you can tell him everything yourself," completed Martha. "It's a fair deal." As the two women sealed that silent pact, neither of them noticed Sebastian, the butler, observing the scene from the shadows. His calculating eyes gleamed with the possibility of using that information to his advantage. Saturday's dinner promised to be an interesting event. Richard had asked the chef to prepare a special menu, but Martha insisted on helping in the kitchen. Her presence in the mansion had already created a completely new dynamic among the staff. Even the somber Sebastian seemed more affable when she was around. "I don't think it's appropriate for Mr. Richard's guest to be cutting vegetables," commented the chef, watching Martha prepare a soup that wasn't on the menu. "I'm not just a guest," she replied with a smile. "I'm an old lady who likes to keep her hands busy, and besides, I bet no one here knows how to make a potato soup like I do." The aroma that was beginning to spread through the kitchen gave her reason. The chef, after tasting a spoonful, had to admit it was exceptional. At 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Laura was the first to arrive, wearing an elegant navy blue dress, bringing a bottle of wine. "Welcome," Richard received her, trying to disguise the impact her beauty caused. "You look stunning," Laura smiled, a little embarrassed. "Thank you. I hope I'm not too formal for the occasion." "You're perfect," he replied, leading her to the living room. "Let me introduce you to Martha." The elderly woman was sitting in an armchair, regal in her simplicity. She wore the same simple dress as always, but had tied her grey hair in an elegant bun. "Miss Martha, this is Laura Winters, my... Your right hand in the company. I know," completed Martha, rising to greet the young woman. "Richard speaks very highly of you." Laura cast a surprised look at Richard before smiling at the elderly woman. "I hope only good things. He said you're competent, dedicated, and that you have the most expressive eyes he's ever seen." Richard choked on his own air. "I didn't say that last part." "Perhaps not in those words," laughed Martha, "but it was written in your expression when you talked about her." The awkward moment was interrupted by Anthony Meyer's arrival. Sebastian led him to the living room, where the man immediately dominated the environment with his imposing presence and thunderous voice. "Here's the mysterious nephew and his special guest," he exclaimed, advancing with heavy steps. Upon seeing Martha, however, his expression changed completely. The social smile froze, giving way to a sudden pallor. "You," he murmured. Martha faced him with serenity. "Hello, Anthony. It's been a long time." Richard looked from one to the other, confused. "You know each other?" "Know is a strong word," replied Anthony, regaining his composure. Let's say we've crossed paths in the past. I worked for the Meyer family many years ago, explained Martha with simplicity. Anthony was just a young man at the time. Richard's uncle seemed extremely uncomfortable. That was more than 40 years ago. Surprising that you're still around. The inelegant comment made Laura furrow her brow, but Martha just smiled. Life has its plans for each of us. Mine apparently included this reunion. Richard, sensing the growing tension, suggested they move to the dining room. During the meal, the dynamics between the four was fascinating to observe. Laura and Martha conversed animatedly about literature and politics, while Anthony remained taciturn, casting suspicious glances at the elderly woman whenever he thought no one was watching. When it came time for dessert, Martha's famous potato soup served as a final surprise. Anthony finally broke his calculated silence. So Richard, he began with false casualness, how long do you plan to keep your charity work? The entire table fell silent. Laura looked at Anthony with evident disapproval, while Richard placed his spoon beside his plate, tensing his jaw. Miss Martha is not a charity work, Uncle. She's my guest and at this moment is more of a mentor than anything else. Anthony laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Mentor? Please, Richard. What could a woman who has spent her life serving others teach the CEO of one of the largest development companies in the country? Perhaps precisely because she has served others, she has much to teach, replied Laura, her voice calm but firm. Some of the wisest people I've known never had their names in business magazines. Martha observed the scene with tranquility, as if watching a play whose conclusion she already knew. Actually, Anthony, she intervened, your question is valid. How long will I stay here? She turned to Richard. I think I'm already abusing your hospitality, my dear. Don't say that, protested Richard. Your presence has brought life to this house. I want you to stay as long as you wish. Anthony snorted. Always impulsive, always emotional, just like your mother. The mention of Richard's mother fell like a bomb at the table. He rarely spoke of her, and when he did, it was always with a mixture of reverence and hurt. Leave Elizabeth out of this, he warned, with a coldness that surprised even Laura, who had never seen him lose his composure. Why? Challenged Anthony. Because she was too fragile to raise her own son and needed nannies and housekeepers to do the job for her. Or because when she finally decided to act like a mother, it was too late. Richard stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. Enough! I won't allow you to speak of her like that. My mother did the best she could in the circumstances she had. So your father spoiled her too much, continued Anthony, relentless. Charles always treated her like a porcelain doll, and when you were born, she simply couldn't handle the responsibility. That's why he hired Martha, isn't it? To be the mother she couldn't be. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked at Martha, his face a mask of confusion and incredulity. What is he talking about? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Martha rose slowly, walking until she stood beside Richard. I was going to tell you when the time was right. But yes, I was your nanny when you were a child. I took care of you from when you were a newborn until you were 5 years old. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered, leaning on the table. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to know me as I am now, not through the memories of a child, she replied with watery eyes. And because I needed to understand the man you had become before revealing the boy I knew. Laura observed the scene, feeling like an intruder before such an intimate moment. Anthony, on the other hand, seemed satisfied with the chaos he had provoked. See, he said, also standing up, your mentor began your relationship with a lie, typical of servants, always hiding something. He picked up his jacket. Thank you for dinner, nephew. It was revealing. After Anthony's departure, silence weighed in the room. Laura, realizing she should leave them alone, also stood up. I think I should go, she said softly. Richard, if you need anything. He nodded, still absorbing the impact of the revelation. Thank you for coming, Laura. After escorting her to the door, Richard returned to the dining room where Martha remained seated, patiently awaiting the judgment she knew was coming. Why did you come back? He asked finally. After so many years, why appear now? Martha sighed, looking out the window into the dark night. Because I felt it was time. Because I saw your face in a magazine and recognized in your eyes the same emptiness that I carry in mine. And because, before departing this world, I needed to know if that sweet boy I knew still existed inside you. Richard sat down heavily. I don't remember you. You were very young, she smiled with sadness, but you used to call me Tha because you couldn't pronounce Martha, and you slept hugging a stuffed horse that I sewed for you. A distant memory flashed in Richard's mind. The soft touch of the toy, the lavender smell of someone singing softly to him. For the horse, he murmured. It was brown with a black mane. And a white star on its forehead, completed Martha, her eyes shining. You called it Star, even though it was a boy. Richard felt a wave of emotion so intense he could barely breathe. Fragments of memory, long buried, began to emerge. Why did you leave? Why did you leave us? Martha's expression became somber. It wasn't by my choice. Your mother. She feared you were becoming too attached to me. One day she called me to her room and said my services were no longer needed. She gave me a week to find another job and leave the house. My mother fired you, but why? She had her demons, Richard. She suffered from a deep melancholy that today we would call depression. She alternated between periods of complete emotional absence and moments of extreme possessiveness. When she was well, she wanted to be the only person in your life. When she was unwell, she could barely look at you. Richard closed his eyes, feeling an old pain resurface. I remember what it was like. I never knew which version of her I would find in the morning. She loved you, Richard, said Martha with gentleness. In her way, with the emotional tools she had, but her love was complicated, full of fear and insecurity. And after you left? I tried to maintain contact. I sent letters, presents on your birthday, but I never received a response. Years later, I learned that your mother had, she hesitated, avoiding the word Richard feared to hear, passed away. By that time you were already in college. I thought about looking for you, but feared I would only bring more pain. Richard abruptly stood up and walked to a bookshelf. From there, he retrieved a small carved wooden box that Martha hadn't seen before. He opened it and took out a small, shiny object. This crystal horse, he said, showing it to Martha. It appeared in my college dorm on the day I turned 21. No sender, no card, just this object, wrapped in a blue fabric. Martha brought her hand to her mouth, moved. You kept it. I always thought it was from my mother, a last gift from beyond the grave. It was the only time I managed to reach you, confessed Martha. I asked a university employee to deliver it. It was meant to be a reminder. Of what? That there was a time when you were loved simply, without complications. A time when someone put your well-being above everything else. Richard stared at the small object he had kept for so many years, now seeing it in a new light. That's why you tested me that night, isn't it? Dropping the wallet, seeing if I would lie. Martha smiled. I wanted to see what kind of man you had become, if there was still kindness behind the sad eyes I saw in the magazine. And what did you discover? That you are like most of us, lost, but still looking for the way, hurt, but still capable of healing, alone, but still yearning for connection. Richard sat down again, absorbing it all. What happens now? That depends on you, replied Martha softly. I can leave in the morning if you prefer. Or I can stay and help you rediscover parts of yourself that were forgotten. The choice is yours. He looked at the small crystal horse in his hand, feeling its weight and significance. In that moment, he made a decision that would change not only his future, but that of many others. I want you to stay, he said firmly, and I want you to help me do something meaningful with all that I have. Martha's smile illuminated her wrinkled face. Then let's begin, my dear. There is so much good to be done in this world. The following weeks brought a series of changes to Richard's life. At the company, he began to reevaluate projects, prioritizing those with greater social impact over the purely profitable ones. This new approach caused friction with Anthony, who saw his nephew's decisions as dangerous sentimentalism. You're going to ruin everything your father built, vociferated Anthony during a tense board meeting. This housing project downtown is going to drain our resources, and the financial return is minimal." "Return isn't measured only in money," replied Richard, with a calmness that surprised everyone. "Revitalizing that area will mean new opportunities for hundreds of families." "Since when do you care about families?" provoked Anthony. "It's that old woman, isn't it? Filling your head with romantic ideas." Laura, who was participating in the meeting, intervened. "The numbers I presented show that the project is viable. Lower profit margin, yes, but sustainable and with potential for appreciation in the long term. Besides, the company's image—" "Image?" interrupted Anthony, hitting the table. "Charles Meyer didn't build this empire concerned with image." "My father," corrected Richard, "built this empire thinking about the future, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The tension in the room was palpable. Anthony looked around, realizing that the other directors seemed more inclined to support Richard than him. "I see you've already made your decision," he said, rising. "But know that I won't watch the destruction of this legacy with folded arms." After his uncle's dramatic exit, Richard let out a tired sigh. Laura approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "He'll get over it," she said softly. "Or not. Either way, you're doing the right thing." Richard covered her hand with his, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the others present. "Thank you, Laura, for everything." At the mansion, meanwhile, Martha had initiated her own silent revolution. She began inviting children from the local orphanage to spend afternoons in the immense garden, with the help of Sebastian, who, surprisingly, revealed himself to be an excellent storyteller. She organized picnics and games that filled the previously silent property with laughter and commotion. Helen, initially resistant to this invasion, soon found herself won over by the children. In no time, she was teaching the girls to make cookies in the main kitchen, something that would have been unthinkable weeks before. On a particularly sunny afternoon, Richard returned earlier than usual from work and found the garden filled with children. Martha was sitting under a tree, telling a story to an attentive group, while others played tag among the flower beds. "I hope you don't mind," she said when she saw him approach. "I thought this house deserved a little more life." Richard observed the scene. The garden that his mother had kept meticulously organized was now a space for play and joy. Instead of feeling bothered, he realized that this was exactly what the place had always needed. "It's perfect," he replied, sitting beside her. "I should have done this years ago." A little girl of approximately 5 years approached timidly, offering Richard a flower picked from the garden. "This is for you, sir," she said with a smile missing 2 teeth. "Miss Martha said you like yellow flowers." Richard accepted the gift with a genuine smile. "Thank you, they are my favorites. What's your name?" "Sophie," replied the girl. "Well, Sophie, you just made my day much better." The child smiled and ran back to the games. Richard turned to Martha. "How did you know I like yellow flowers?" "You used to collect them when you were little," she replied with a nostalgic smile. "You always said they were little pieces of sun that we could hold in our hands." Richard felt a wave of emotion at recovering another fragment of his past. "There's so much I don't remember." "Memory is funny," reflected Martha. "Sometimes we don't remember the events themselves, but the feelings they caused us. You may not remember picking flowers, but you carry with you the comfort they brought you." That night, after the children had been taken back to the orphanage, Richard and Martha were dining quietly when Sebastian announced an unexpected visit. "Miss Winters is here, sir." Richard stood up, surprised. "Laura, did something happen at the company?" Laura entered the dining room, looking agitated. "Sorry to show up without warning, but I needed to speak with you in person." She noticed Martha and smiled. "Good evening, Ms. Martha." "Join us, dear," invited the elderly woman. "There's still plenty of food." While Sebastian arranged a place for Laura, Richard watched her with concern. "What happened?" Laura waited for the butler to move away before answering. "Your uncle met with Jacob Hirano this afternoon." Richard frowned. Hirano was the leader of the Japanese investment group with whom he was negotiating the partnership for the housing project. "How did you know about this?" "His secretary is my college friend. He doesn't know she told me." "And what did my uncle want with Hirano?" Laura looked at Martha, as if hesitating to speak in front of her. "You can say it," assured Richard. "I have no secrets from Ms. Martha." Laura nodded. Your uncle is trying to convince Hirano that you're not mentally stable enough to lead the company. He's claiming that you've been making irrational decisions and that you've fallen under the influence of people who want to manipulate you. Richard let out a bitter laugh. Typical of him. And what did Hirano say? Apparently he's concerned. He wants a new meeting, this time with your uncle present, to clarify some points. Martha observed the conversation in silence, her serene face masking the concern she felt. When? Asked Richard. Tomorrow morning. Jacob is returning to Tokyo tomorrow night, so it's our only chance. Richard nodded, thoughtful. We'll show him who really has the vision for the future of Maya Developments. After dinner, when Laura had already left, Martha found Richard in the library, examining documents for the project. Your uncle is afraid, she commented, sitting in a nearby armchair. Of what? Of change, of losing control, of seeing the family legacy transformed into something he doesn't recognize or value. Richard looked up from the papers. Are you defending him? Just trying to understand, clarified Martha. When we know people's motivations, even if we don't agree with them, we can find paths for dialogue. Anthony doesn't want dialogue, retorted Richard. He wants power. He always has. My father always said he was envious of others' success. Martha remained silent for a moment. You look so much like your father sometimes. The same determination, the same intensity, but you have your mother's heart, sensitive, deep, capable of great compassion. You really believe my mother was compassionate after the way she treated you? The elderly woman sighed. Elizabeth was sick, Richard, not in the way you can see, but inside. Her depression consumed her like a slow fire, burning everything good in her. In her moments of lucidity, she was the kindest person I've ever known. Richard closed his eyes, recalling the rare moments of connection with his mother. A smile, a song sung softly, an unexpected hug. I wish I had known her better. I knew her in the best way you could given the circumstances, consoled Martha. And now you have the chance to honor what was best in her. That conversation made Richard reflect deeply on his past and the legacy he wished to build. The next morning, when he entered the meeting room to meet Hirano and his uncle, he felt strangely calm. Anthony was already there, conversing with the Japanese businessman in a confidential tone. Both fell silent when Richard entered, accompanied by Laura. Good morning, gentlemen, greeted Richard with a cordiality that surprised his uncle. Mr. Hirano, it's always a pleasure to see you again. Jacob Hirano, a 60-year-old man with an imposing presence despite his short stature, slightly inclined, his head. Mr. Meyer, your assistant mentioned that there are issues to be clarified about our joint project. Indeed, replied Richard, sitting down. My uncle seems to have some concerns that he would like to share with us. Anthony, please, feel free to express your opinions openly. Caught by surprise by his nephew's direct approach, Anthony hesitated for a moment. Well, as I was explaining to Mr. Hirano, I have serious reservations about the economic viability of this housing project. Maya Developments has always focused on high-end ventures, and this sudden change of focus may compromise our financial health in the long term. Richard listened patiently without interrupting. When his uncle finally finished his exposition, he turned to Hirano. Mr. Hirano, the Katsuo Group has always prided itself on its social impact projects, hasn't it? The sustainable condominium in Yokohama, the residential complex for the elderly in Osaka, all with a perfect balance between social responsibility and economic viability. The Japanese businessman seemed surprised and pleased that Richard knew his company's projects in such detail. Exactly. We believe that true business success must include a positive contribution to society. It's exactly this vision that we admire in your group, continued Richard. And that's why this partnership makes so much sense. We're not abandoning our business principles. We're expanding our horizon to include projects that, besides being profitable, also generate social value. Laura distributed folders with detailed financial projections. As you can see, the return on investment is more modest, but extremely stable, and the positive impact on the image of both companies is already being reflected in the value of our stocks. Anthony seemed increasingly uncomfortable, as the meeting progressed. It was evident that his attempt to undermine Hirano's confidence was failing. "There's still another aspect I'd like to discuss," said Richard, surprising everyone. "An expansion of the original project." He unrolled architectural plans that no one in the room, not even Laura, had seen before. "I propose that we include within the housing complex a community center that offers support to families in vulnerable situations, care for the elderly, activities for children, professional training." Hirano examined the plans with growing interest. "Ambitious. And who would manage this center?" "A foundation I'm creating," replied Richard. "The Elizabeth Meyer Foundation, in honor of my mother." Anthony paled at hearing his sister-in-law's name. Laura observed everything with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Interesting," murmured Hirano. "Very interesting. In Japan we have a concept called ikigai, the purpose that gives meaning to life. It seems you've found yours, Mr. Meyer." The meeting ended with Hirano not only reaffirming his commitment to the original project, but also expressing enthusiasm for the expansion proposed by Richard. As they said goodbye, the Japanese businessman made a comment that would remain engraved in the memory of all those present. "Your father built buildings, Mr. Meyer. You are building communities. That's a natural and admirable evolution." When Hirano and his entourage left the room, Anthony confronted his nephew. "You planned all this, didn't you? You knew I would talk to Hirano and prepared this show to make me look like a fool." "No, uncle," replied Richard calmly. "I just did what I believe is right for the company and for me. As for the community center, the idea came to me last night after a conversation with Martha." "That woman!" exclaimed Anthony with bitterness. "She always knew how to manipulate this family." Laura, who was organizing the documents from the meeting, looked at Anthony with undisguised disapproval. "From what I understand, Ms. Martha only took care of Richard as a child. That can hardly be called manipulation." "You know nothing," retorted Anthony. "Ask her about Charles and Elizabeth. Ask her about the accident." Richard frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Anthony smiled, a cold and calculating smile. "Oh, your dear Martha didn't tell the whole story, did she? Ask her how your father really departed this world. Ask her who was driving the car that night." With those enigmatic words, Anthony left the room, leaving Richard paralyzed by the insinuation. "He's just trying to cause discord," said Laura, concerned with Richard's expression. "Don't listen to him." But the seed of doubt had been planted. That same afternoon, Richard returned to the mansion earlier, determined to confront Martha and discover what else she might be hiding from him. Upon entering the mansion, Richard found an unusual silence. Since Martha's arrival, the house was rarely so quiet. He looked for the elderly woman in all the usual places, living room, garden, kitchen, without success. "Helen," he called the housekeeper, "where is Miss Martha?" "In the attic, sir," replied Helen with a worried look. "She's been there for hours, said she needed to find something." Richard climbed the stairs that led to the attic, a space he rarely visited. The door was ajar, and he could hear the sound of objects being moved. Martha was kneeling before an old trunk, carefully removing what appeared to be photo albums and small boxes. Upon hearing Richard's footsteps, she turned. "Ah, you came home." "Early," she said with a tired smile. "I was just looking for something related to my father's death," interrupted Richard, his voice harder than he intended. Martha's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of deep sadness. "Anthony spoke to you. He insinuated that there's more to the story than you told me, that you were somehow involved in the accident that took my father's life." Martha closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "Sit down, Richard. This is a story I should have told you before." He sat on an old trunk, his heart beating rapidly. "Your father," began Martha, "was an extraordinary man. Not just for his business success, but for his ability to see the best in people. It was he who insisted that your mother keep me as your nanny, even when she began to show jealousy. My father defended you. He understood that you needed stability, someone constant in your life, while your mother fought against her inner demons." Martha sighed. "Charles was the balance of the family. When he traveled, Elizabeth became even more unstable." Richard nodded, vaguely recalling the anxiety he felt when his father left on business trips. On the night of the accident, continued Martha, her voice almost a whisper, your mother was having one of her episodes. There had been days when she wouldn't leave her room, barely ate. Your father decided to take her out to dinner, try to cheer her up. Martha paused, taking a deep breath. I advised them not to go. The weather was bad, it was raining heavily. But Charles believed that the change of environment would do Elizabeth good. Richard felt his heart tighten. He had never heard the details of that night. After the early loss of his parents, the subject became taboo among the family members, who took over his upbringing. The car skidded on the wet road, proceeded Martha, tears now flowing freely down her face. Charles, he didn't survive the impact. Elizabeth was severely injured but conscious. I was the first to arrive at the scene after receiving the call from the hospital. You were there? Richard felt a chill. I was with your mother in her final moments, confirmed Martha. She made me promise I would take care of you, but what? Your Uncle Anthony assumed your guardianship. He never allowed me to see you again. He claimed that I was just an employee and had no rights over you, and perhaps he was right. Martha wiped away her tears. What Anthony probably didn't tell you is that he blames me for the accident. How so? He believes that if I hadn't been so present in your lives, Elizabeth wouldn't have developed her emotional problems, that if I didn't exist, she would have been a normal mother, and that night would never have happened. Martha shook her head. It's easier to blame a stranger than to accept that Elizabeth was sick and needed professional help that she never received. Richard processed all of this, realizing how the narrative of his childhood had been built on half-truths and omissions. Why would my uncle say you were driving the car? Because in the beginning, when you were too young to understand, he tried to formally accuse me. He even suggested to the police that I had sabotaged the car. It was such a great absurdity that it was quickly dismissed, but Anthony never abandoned this idea. Martha extended her hand, gently touching Richard's face. He lost the brother he loved and needed someone to blame. Richard felt a deep compassion for his uncle, understanding for the first time the bitterness that had consumed him for so many years. What were you looking for here? He asked, indicating the open trunk. Martha reached for a small package wrapped in fabric. This, something I've kept all these years, waiting for the right moment to return to you. Richard unwrapped the package carefully, revealing an old gold pocket watch. On the lid, the initials CM were engraved in an elaborate monogram. My father's watch, he murmured, recognizing the object from old photographs. Elizabeth gave it to me on the night of the accident, explained Martha. She said that one day when you were a man I should give it to you. That's why I came back, Richard, to fulfill this last promise. Richard opened the watch, noticing that the hands were stopped at 11:47, probably the exact moment of the accident. On the inside of the lid, there was an inscription he had never seen before. Time is the only truly valuable asset. Use it wisely. He always said that, recalled Richard with a lump in his throat. That time was more precious than money. Your father was a wise man, agreed Martha, and he would be proud of the man you've become. As he held the watch, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic, Richard made a decision. I want you to run the Elizabeth Meyer Foundation, he said, surprising Martha. No one knew my mother better. No one understood her struggles better. The foundation will help families affected by mental illness, will offer support to children whose parents face these challenges. It will be a place where people won't need to suffer in silence, as my mother suffered. Martha stared at him, moved. Are you sure about this? Absolutely, confirmed Richard, and I want my Uncle Anthony to be part of it too. It's time to heal old wounds, to transform all this pain into something positive. That conversation in the attic marked the beginning of a new phase in Richard's life. In the months that followed, as the housing project advanced and the foundation began to take shape, a visible transformation occurred in both him and the people around him. Laura, who before saw Richard only as a brilliant but distant boss, discovered in him a partner with whom she shared values and dreams. Their professional relationship naturally evolved into something more, though both maintained discretion in the work environment. Anthony, initially resistant to getting involved with the foundation, was gradually won over by his nephew's persistence and the opportunity to honor his brother's memory. Although he never directly apologized to Martha, he developed with her a relationship of mutual respect based on their shared love for Richard. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, became a place of gatherings and celebrations. The orphanage children were regular visitors, and Richard initiated a program whereby some families from the housing project spent time on the property while establishing themselves in the city. 1 year after the reunion with Martha, on a golden autumn afternoon, Richard found her in the garden, watching a small girl play with the fallen leaves. It was Sophie, the little girl who had offered him a yellow flower that first day. She had been adopted by a young couple who worked at the foundation's community center. "She looks happy," commented Richard, sitting beside Martha. "As you look happy," replied the elderly woman, smiling, "you've finally found your purpose." "Thanks to you," he said, holding the wrinkled hand of the woman who had changed his life twice, first in childhood and now decades later. Martha shook her head. "I only reminded you of the boy you were. A boy who marveled at yellow flowers and believed he could hold pieces of sun in his hands." Richard smiled, feeling a peace he had never imagined possible. His father's watch, which had been stopped, now worked again, hanging on a chain around his neck. He had repaired it, but kept the original face with its marks of time. "You know what surprises me most?" reflected Richard. "How something that begins with a lie can lead to so much truth." Martha laughed softly. "Life rarely follows a straight path, my dear. Sometimes we need to get lost to find the true way." At that moment, Laura approached, carrying a basket of fruit for the picnic they had planned. Her smile upon seeing Richard illuminated her entire face. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked. "Never," replied Martha, making room on the bench. "We were just remembering how it all began. With a deliberately dropped wallet and a man pretending to be blind," completed Richard, exchanging a knowing look with Martha. Laura sat between them, curious. "You never told me that story properly." "It's a long story," smiled Richard. "It begins on a night like any other, when a man who had lost his way found a lady who had already lost everything, but who, even so, had much to offer." As Richard narrated his story to Laura, with Martha occasionally correcting details or adding perspectives, Sophie approached, bringing more yellow flowers to add to the picnic basket. The gentle autumn wind carried promises of better days, and the last rays of sun that afternoon seemed to bless that improvised family, united not by blood, but by love and healing that only time and truth can provide. At the Meyer mansion, the lights began to come on one by one, pushing away the shadows and illuminating the path for all who found shelter, purpose and, above all, the chance to begin again.